Everyone, this is the January edition of Treasure Valley Data Enthusiasts, and we have with us today a couple housekeeping items, and then we'll turn it over to Sean. If you're not receiving these invitations, if somebody forwarded them to you, you can email me and I'll add you to the list. If you have any ideas of future topics, please give me that feedback as well. I have a few out there that I've been talking to. There's a few of you on this call. We'd love to hear your stories. Some have presented last year. If it's been more than a year, we'd like to hear how you've done since you last presented. So please feed those forward to me. We're always looking for good topics. And speaking of good topics, we have a good one today. Sean Hewitt's an international expert. I say international, he comes to us from the Toronto area up north. And so today he's going to give us his practical approach on data governance. And Sean comes highly recommended. He and I haven't worked together, but we met recently. And so I wanted to bring him in. He's got a lot of expertise here. So with that, Sean, I'm going to stop presenting and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I'll just set up my screen here. Okay, and
there you are.
I just have to do a quick switch here. Downfall of having multiple screens. Okay, you should be able to see the full screen presentation. All good? Okay. Well, thanks again for having me. I was telling Michael earlier through email that I really enjoy speaking to groups that already have some understanding of data governance, and it's not often that I come across people who really understand it well enough to have a deep conversation about it. So, and I'm assuming that this group has varying levels of understanding around data governance. So I've kind of mixed things up a bit, some high level and some detailed concepts for us to talk about. So hopefully everybody takes something away from this session. So a little bit about myself first. Well, agenda, I'm just going to fill in a little more detail about who I am and why I think I have the knowledge to share with you and how I got that, and how I perceive data governance. Everybody sees it a little differently, so I think it'll be helpful for you to understand my perspective of what data governance is and its purpose. And then we'll get into the meat of the session, which is really looking at what I perceive as the success factors. So when I'm working with organizations, what are the things that I'm looking for that really help optimize their data governance program, and those levers that we can pull to really make a difference. And then the concept of integrated data governance. What is it? What is the value? And I have an example of how we approach it that will hopefully be helpful for you. And then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some open Q&A. So to get started, so I probably have, my journey in data governance is probably very similar to some of yours, where I kind of stumbled into it. I really didn't know it existed until well into my career. And I started off working with a lot of data, doing decision support in a telecom business, and focusing on network planning and provisioning, ultimately managing a team there that was responsible for mapping out the expansion of our telecom network and ordering bandwidth and managing bandwidth. And gradually that evolved into focusing specifically on business intelligence and decision support, moving into an IT function in the middle here, where I was eventually leading a team of 14 business intelligence analysts and developers and for a global food manufacturing company that primarily operated in Canada, but we had many different divisions with different data systems, and ultimately we had a self-serve environment with over 60 Cognos cubes at that time that we were managing. And to do that, we weren't leveraging data governance at that point, but we were, the company Maple Leaf Foods was heavily invested in Six Sigma. So we had a lot of access to Six Sigma methodologies and tools. And I myself was trained as a black belt and was able to incorporate those concepts into the solutions we were delivering for both risk management and issue management. And then eventually moving out of that full-time role into a consulting role, continuing in business intelligence, analytics, and data governance. So coming out of my full-time role, I began to learn more about data governance and the value. And I saw that as the biggest gap that a lot of the analytics solutions had. So when they weren't delivering the value that people wanted, it was usually because of gaps in governance, either related to quality or usually related to quality. I wasn't doing much in privacy at that point. So then we started focusing on identifying what did we need to do within that solution to guarantee we're getting the desired outcome. And that's the solution-based governance. So looking at the solution itself and just managing the data within that solution. And then eventually getting into project or process-based data governance, where you're going across systems and solutions and looking at all of the data consumed by that process or that project and what you need to do to get the desired outcomes out of that project and process. And then eventually getting to the point where I was looking at enterprise data governance and how to really get the entire organization working together efficiently so you don't have conflicts between functional groups and data ownership, data quality, data usage, all of those things. And as you can see from the bottom, there's a lot of different industries that I've spent time working with. So, which has given me a good perspective or a broad perspective on what's working in different areas. And as many of you know, it's not a template type thing. We can't just take the model, the governance model that's working in one industry and take it to another. And even companies within the same industry really doesn't work that way. You have to really understand that organization, their strengths and weaknesses, the people, the culture, and then come up with a framework that really works well for them. And that's what makes data governance so tricky. So that's enough about me. So let's move on here. Why is that not moving on? Okay. So what is data governance? So for me, data governance is really a way to optimize the actual data value that we are getting while minimizing the data risk. And I've highlighted actual data value here, or the word actual, because I like to differentiate between data as an asset and data as a liability. So if we are going to get the actual value out of the data, we have to take it all the way from the creation or consumption of that data through to somebody using that to generate value or revenue or, for strategic reasons. So we want to see that data consumed in a way that really benefits the organization. And a lot of the times, early on in my business intelligence career, and I still see it now when I'm working with some organizations, they have this if you build it, they will come attitude where you invest a lot of money in data warehouses and analytics and then just hope that somebody's going to use it and you're going to get the value out of it, or the you're going to realize that ROI. It doesn't happen. And a lot of the times it's because there's no data governance included in that project or with that solution. And as a result, there's a lack of trust and the adoption of that tool doesn't happen. And that's really where I see data governance coming in, is one, providing the guidelines and policies and standards and other tools that can really help you manage trust and confidence in those analytical solutions. And I don't only look at governance, data governance from an analytics perspective. I look at it from an operational perspective. But most of the clients that are bringing me in are looking at analytical projects versus operational data governance. Okay, so some of the other key things that we're looking at with data governance is communication and alignment. So on the left, I have the data management areas that are defined in the DMBOK version 2. So each of these will be prescribing standards and potentially policies and have issues and different things that need to be considered when we are designing solutions, whether operational or analytical solutions. And part of the role of data governance is making sure that we have adherence to that and that we have synergies between these groups and they're all working together. And we don't have cases where they are actually working against each other, where we have data architecture going one way and our storage and operations resources doing something completely different that conflicts with the data architecture standards that have been set. And then on top of that, we have the traditional aspect of data governance, which is defining the authority and roles and responsibility associated with each of these groups, and as well as the stewards and data owners and people like that. Okay. So success factors. So, I'm just letting you get a glimpse into my brain here as to what I see, and these are the things I focus on when I go into an organization to really help them fine-tune their program if they have an existing program, or when we're starting, we look at these items to see are there things we can build on instead of starting from scratch. And like any program, so if you have an IT program management department, an IT PMO or anything like that, you know that it's hard to distill it down to 2 or 3 key success factors. So there are many success factors that have different impacts in different organizations, right? So things like collaboration, training, and support, that is really the significance of that is really dependent on the size of the organization, the complexity of the data, and what their starting point is, and same with the data governance policy. So the policy, we really use that to drive alignment, set the mandate for the data governance organization, and really use that as a flag that we can wave to get everybody in line. And my approach is really to avoid policies as much as possible, but we still need that governance policy as a platform to go by. I believe in using guidelines versus policies when possible, just because I see them as being more agile. So if we focus on a few of these, if I had to call a few of them out as being very critical, the program manager role for me is one of the key things that I see making a difference for organizations. So this is doesn't need to be a full-time resource, but this is a person who's been designated as being responsible for the administration of data governance. So there's a lot of coordination that has to happen. So this person is the linchpin. They're making sure that everybody's doing what they need to do. They have the knowledge and tools they need to do it, that if there's any delays, that somebody is looking into that and things are being escalated when needed, and that everybody is aware of what those policies are. And that's where things like communication come into play. So we have change management, and within change management, we would have our communication plan in there and issue resolution plan. So the program manager would oversee those components of it. Okay, also the data catalog and business glossary, of course, are important aspects of data governance success, because you really can't manage something if you're really not aware of what you have. So if you haven't documented your data assets to a point that you can actually understand where the risk is and where the opportunities are to leverage that data to generate more value, then you're really not able to govern that data. Okay, so if you haven't created that catalog, that's where I would start. Even if you haven't formalized a mature data governance framework, the trick is cataloging the data in a way that it's sustainable. And I've seen a lot of organizations, pull a lot of, basically create a data dictionary in Excel, and then, 2 weeks later it's obsolete, right? So we want to find a way to have a sustainable catalog that is owned and updated on a regular basis, which is tricky. Quite often we'll start people with something like SharePoint, a list in SharePoint where other people can access that and search it, and you can add annotations to it. And it's a very simple solution without throwing a lot of money into a enterprise class data catalog tool when you really don't even know if you can sustain that level of rigor. So validate that you can maintain that catalog first before you throw all of that money at it. Okay, and same with the business glossary. Having a mature risk management process is a big success factor as well. So having a standard approach, it doesn't have to be extremely complex, just a standard way to log risks and issues. I look at issues as a risk that has 100% probability, whereas a risk could be something that may or may not happen. And so having a standardized process to log that, have it quickly assessed, and then prioritize based on the probability and impact. So you can really focus on the things that you really need to focus on. And a lot of success behind data governance is learning how to work smart. You don't have to address everything. So half the battle is deciding what you need to tackle and what you don't. Okay. And then knowledge management is definitely, in my mind, a key success factor. So companies, a lot of companies I work with have an older demographic in their employees, and they're losing a lot of knowledge, and retaining that knowledge, not just for data governance, but for data management as a whole, is important. So having a method to capture that information and share it with the people who need it. So if you look at this from a stewardship perspective, the stewards are gaining knowledge. So we assign them a data domain, and they are acquiring knowledge in that domain. How do we share that knowledge with the people who are consuming that data and using it to support their job? And that will improve their overall data literacy and help them generate more value out of that data that they use, or help them identify when there are issues with that data, whether the issue be data quality or data privacy, really helping increase the awareness of what the data is, how to use it, and how to identify those issues and risks is important. And then that dovetails into training and support, which is both on the data and the tools you need to use it. So I see a lot of cases where people are given tools to use for reporting and analytics or various things, and not given the training and support to really optimize their use of that tool. And then they get frustrated, and then when we come along and ask them to do some stewardship functions or stuff like that, there's a lot of pushback because they're afraid they're going to be set up for failure. So by focusing on training and support, we want to set them up for success instead of setting them up to fail. Okay, so those are some of the key success factors that I see in with the engagements that I've had over my career. And these evolve over time as the environment changes, nature of data changes, and the requirements for data governance change as well. So integrated data governance. So this is an interesting concept that is something that I've been passionate about for many years, and I kind of stumbled into it by accident. So this is really where we're building data governance features into our data-driven processes. So instead of retrofitting things to do governance, so to govern data quality and privacy, we are including the governance features during the design and development of these solutions. So why do we do this? What's the value of doing that? Some people I talk to think that it slows down the agile development process, and you could say that, but when you look at the overall process of developing something and then getting it tested and into production, it actually saves time because you have less rework to meet the quality targets and satisfy any regulatory requirements, things like that. But there's a lot of other benefits of doing this. So all of you have probably been in the situation where an IT project or a data-driven project has failed because you get it out there and then the users don't trust it, and then you have low adoption. So either you're not able to sunset an old system because they're not able to get all of their data over to your new system, or they spend a lot of time double checking the information because there were a couple hiccups at the beginning, and now they don't trust the data, and it doesn't matter what you do, you can't get them to the point where they trust the data enough just to take that number and run with it and make decisions based on it. And that creates a lot of overhead and cost. We need to make sure that anything we create now, that we are protecting the data appropriately, and whether it's privacy requirements or financial reporting requirements, we need to ensure compliance. And ignorance of privacy requirements and financial reporting requirements is not a defense. So we need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what those requirements are, and that the solution does not create any additional risk or unacceptable risk for your organization. We want to optimize the solution for usability and extensibility. Right. So when we're building something, sometimes we get the goggles on or the blinders on, and we just plow ahead and we deliver something without looking at how, with some minor adjustments to the design, can we extend this to meet other requirements, or set it up so it can be extended to other requirements? And are there any aspects of the design that will really prevent people from getting the value out of it? So having a solution built where I've seen a lot of cases where an amazing data warehouse has been designed. They put a lot of thought and time and come up with an amazingly innovative data warehouse or data vault, and they didn't spend enough time thinking about how people are going to access that data and actually consume it. So then it sits there and they're not getting value out of it. And that's a great example of where it becomes a liability, because you're paying to host this data, to store this data. You're paying people to maintain it, and nobody's using it, or it's being underutilized. So making sure that we optimize the usability and the extensibility of those data pipelines and any system, even if it's non-analytical, is important. And data governance can help ask the questions to facilitate that aspect of the design. Preventing confusion and errors, and this really talks to the business glossary and making sure we have clarity in definition. So I've been involved in some MDM projects where we were mastering customer and product data, but they hadn't taken the time to standardize the definitions of the attributes for customer and product. So how can you master it if you haven't actually gotten consensus on what those things are? And so we have to stop and make sure we have that before we go too far, that it creates a situation where it's not going to be used, or it's going to create more problems than solve or add value. And then minimizing support requirements. And I'm sure many of you have seen the situation where something is designed, a data-driven process is designed, but it's not easily supportable, that there's a lot of human intervention required, either to deal with issues or even just to do daily tasks or support some aspect of the process, whether it's downloading files or doing conversions or cleanup on files to support the process. So making sure that whatever guidelines we specify for support and operations are met, so we're not setting them up for failure as well. And then, of course, saving money. So anytime that we implement a new data-driven solution, if we haven't considered all of these things, going back and doing rework and creating confusion and putting something into production that does not get adopted, we're really burning money that we don't have, and we want to stop doing that. Right. So in the end, if we are doing all of these things, ultimately we have happy stakeholders, either users or shareholders or the board of directors, whoever that may be. The challenge is they might think that this takes more time, but it's a matter of balancing that rigor with the risk and opportunity to make sure that we are getting the optimal value out of that data-driven solution without creating additional risk for the organization. And that's usually how I present it to the executives. It's not about bureaucracy and having this unnecessary step of going through a governance review. We're really trying to balance the risk with the value here and get the best possible outcome out of the effort that you're putting into these solutions. Okay. So this slide, I wanted to give you a sense of the approach that I take that when tackling something like this. So both for proactively identifying the governance components required for a solution, but also for retrofitting governance into an existing data-driven solution or process. So up front, we have some planning, and usually this involves some prioritization of what opportunities are there. It's either driven by your current pain points, or it could be a new project to create a new solution. So then we go in, we do a diagnostic, and this is where my Six Sigma background comes in, where we look at, at a high level, what are all of the inputs or systems supplying data into this process? What are all of the inputs? So quite often there's multiple systems supplying multiple data entities, whether it's customer, product, sales, or orders. It could be anything coming in. And then the high level process, so what steps are taken to bring that data in, to acquire it? Are we bringing it in from outside the organization? Is it internal? What are all of the steps that gather that information? So we bring that together in a standard template to just get a sense of all of the different nuances of that process. And from there, we have some outputs. We identify what are all of the business terms related to that process or that solution, what are all of the data items that need to be cataloged, and then what are all of the risks or current issues that we need to be aware of, so we can start managing or looking at what are the potential failure points. And there's a tool that I started using when I was doing Six Sigma called a failure mode and effect analysis tool, and we use that a lot. So we look at, if something's going to go wrong and undermine the outcome, what is it? We brainstorm all of that, and we focus on looking at this issue and risk log, and then prioritizing those and deciding which ones we need to address and which ones we don't. But we also, there's always a risk that the solution will create confusion because we don't have standardized definitions for key terms like customer or product or member or patient or whatever that may be, or even something like an order. So if we don't have those standardized terms, once we move that into production, it could be misinterpreted, and we need to make sure that we don't create that risk. And then the data catalog as well. So making sure that we identify all of these data items that are being used in this process. We define those, we assign stewards where necessary, data ownership, anything that we need to track to ensure that we monitor the quality and usability of that data, and be able to reuse it for other purposes as well. So we take all of that information and we do a lot of analysis, and there's a lot of discussions on it, and that gets distilled down to a governance plan. And that governance plan is just a high level. What stewardship do we think is required to really address any issues and risks we have within the data, whether it's data quality, privacy, it could be report stewardship. If you have sensitive reports and you want to make sure that access is vetted before people are given permission to use that report. Do we need to certify reports? Things like that. That would be defined down here as well. Then education requirements. So what do we need to do to make sure that the people using this, the data that we are creating here, have the knowledge they need to use it appropriately, and that they're not going to misuse that information. So from an operational perspective, maybe this education is related to how we are entering master data into Salesforce or something like that. So coming up with a training plan as to how we are going to reduce any risk of bad information being seeded in that system from in the beginning. Okay. Then defining guidelines, policies, and standards. So we're only going to do this when it makes sense. I don't like the idea of defining standards just for the sake of defining standards, because once you've defined it, you have to monitor it and measure adherence to it. Same with policies. So that's why I like avoiding them as much as possible. But there's always going to be a time where a standard, it makes sense based on the level of risk. So if that that data value varies across multiple systems, or that the data format varies across systems, it's going to prevent us from pulling it in and creating a golden record in our MDM solution, right? So then we want to define that standard, and then it enforce adherence to that standard. So part of this, so maybe managing data quality includes, for this solution, includes some process changes. We can't do everything within the system. Quite often, the challenges that we're facing are really people and process related. So we need to tweak the process a little bit to eliminate some issues or mitigate some risks. The control plan is something that has come out of Six Sigma as well, where once we identify what it is we need to measure, so this goes back to that failure mode and effect analysis tool. So once we know where those potential failure points are, we want to define a plan to monitor those and some actions to occur if those quality levels get out of control. So the quality control plan would define, what activities are going to occur, how often is it going to be measured, who's going to measure it, and then what actions occur when that metric gets out of control. Okay. At this point, we're just identifying the need. Right? So we're saying, okay, we need these 3 control plans as part of the solution. We haven't gone as far as actually defining what that control plan is in detail. And then access control plans. So who is going to control access to this data? How are they going to do it? How are we going to monitor usage and any other aspects of access control? And then maybe there's some system changes required to really facilitate improved data quality and other aspects of the solution. So ultimately, it could be anything we think needs to be done in order to really resolve issues and mitigate risks that can undermine the outcome of this data-driven solution. And that gets bundled up in the way of a governance plan. And then we present that to whoever the decision makers are for that project or that subject area. And then all of that activity gets entered in, and this is where the agile aspect of the data governance program comes in. All of that gets added to our backlog. So these are all things we could do, but there's probably 200 other things we could do. So we need to merge that into our backlog, reprioritize it, and start knocking off the top priorities. And then once we schedule those activities, then we flush out any additional details required and then implement those changes, whether it's setting up a new steward. So that involves training that steward, giving them access to the tools they need to perform the function that we want them to, whether it's monitoring data quality or privacy or reports, anything like that. So once we've got that plan, this is the program aspect of it. So we kick off, we identify what do we want to focus on next? Are we improving an existing process, or are we going to start looking at something new that's coming up and identifying the governance plan for that? And then we start planning that work. Okay, so that's kind of our standard approach for identifying what needs to be done. And now I'm going to give you an example of how we would do this for in an integrated way as opposed to retrofitting it. So here's the scenario that maybe some of you have seen something similar to this. So this applies to whether you're a telecom company, a member association, a SaaS company. There's a lot of different overlaps here. So we need to identify and understand customers that are at risk of canceling their subscription at the end of the first year, and that could be saved with minor intervention. So this is really about optimizing our retention efforts, because of course there's going to be customers that you can't save no matter what level of effort you put into saving them. So we're really looking at, with a little nudge, we can actually save these people. And it's always cheaper to save a customer and prevent them from leaving versus going out and getting new customers. So we want to identify these existing customers that have a high probability of renewing their subscription with minor intervention. So to do that, we need to gather a lot of our data about our customers. And this would just be customers who have either canceled or renewed after their first year. So basically every customer that you've had, and that can be hundreds of thousands of records about your customers. And to really do a predictive model, we need some information about those customers. We can't just say, well, this number renewed, this number did not. That really doesn't give us anything we can use to really identify markets or cohorts that we can really target and communicate with. So we need to identify a handful of variables or attributes about these customers to analyze and then come up with some variables that will help us target individuals and send them a promotion email or something to get them to renew. And so let's say in the scenario, we are including some information on ethnicity, as we suspect that it has plays a role in whether or not they renew after the first year. And then you're getting into some privacy concerns, especially if if you have customers who are in Europe, even here in Canada, and a lot of countries around the world now are putting new privacy regulations in place, and something like ethnicity is considered sensitive data. Okay, so then at the end of this, so we have typical development process, we do some analysis and then come up, we do our design and development, a little bit of testing, and then we end up with a predictive model that will identify who we should be contacting and what attributes, including some attributes that really help create the to segment those people into cohorts. Okay, so the integrated approach. So how would we look at this? So we know what the outcome is, what the desired outcome is. We need this predictive model. We have a design that our developers are working on, and they come up with that design. While they're doing that, we're doing ultimately a risk assessment, and we're looking at that through many lenses. We're looking at it from a compliance angle, so privacy. We probably don't have any PCI compliance issues or finance in this case, but you never know. There could be a variety of different compliance requirements there. Data quality. So when you're doing a predictive model, you need to know what is fit for purpose data here, and does this data support that? And then what are the risks to data quality that could undermine the accuracy of this predictive model? Okay, definition. So ethnicity, how are you going to define that so it is clear when people are looking at this that they understand what that means, and other things like gender and even customer in general. What do you mean by customer? So is this somebody who signed up and has actually paid money, or could it be somebody who received a free membership and or other promotions that add additional variables that should be considered. And then usage. Are you going to restrict usage on this predictive model? And if so, how are you going to control that? And then any operational requirements. So if you have prescribed guidelines and standards for operations, is this design going to adhere to those standards? And not just for operations, but for architecture and in any other area of data management that may intersect with the solution. Okay, so coming out of that, we have our governance control plan. We have identified, where do we need stewardship? Where do we need education to make sure that we have this data at the right level of fitness to support this predictive model? What process changes are really required to maximize the value or outcomes that we're getting here? And then quality and access controls. So we define all of that, and that is being brought back into the solution before production. So we can make sure that we have all of those things in place as part of the implementation, because if we don't do these things, and this is typically what happens, these things don't get done, this gets implemented, there's problems with the data quality here, then it undermines the trust that the users have in this solution, and then the team that builds it loses credibility, and it just spirals from there. So if we do this up front, we make sure that these things happen in conjunction with the implementation, you stop those problems before they happen, and you are increasing the probability of meeting expectations when this is delivered. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of how that integrated data governance approach works. Okay, so we have almost 15 minutes left, so I wanted to make sure that I left some time for questions. But before we got into that, I just want to thank you again for letting me speak. I love talking about this stuff, so the more I can do it, the happier I am. And
Thanks.
If anybody does have any follow-up questions, if you don't get a chance to ask your question and you want to reach out to me after, my email is just at the bottom of that slide there.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks again. I really appreciate you talking to us about some pragmatic, practical, implementable solutions. We do have one question coming in from the chat. And before I dive into that, just anyone else who would feel more comfortable posting on the chat, feel free, or you can pipe in verbally as well with your questions or comments. Question from Ken Nixon is, you didn't mention executive commitment in your success factors, and he's just wondering if data governance is able to thrive under the executive radar, or should it be in there?
That's a great question, and the more executive alignment or commitment you have, the better. But I have seen it be successful under the radar as well, and it really depends on the size of the organization, and if you have even so, I've seen cases where the CEO and COO have not been heavily engaged in data governance, but the vice president levels have, and not all of them, just a handful of them, and it's done well. My preference is that you do get alignment from the top level. It just makes it easier, and it sends a strong message, especially with all of the privacy stuff going on now. If you have that engagement and visible engagement from your leaders, it sends a message to everybody else. And if there is an issue that comes up, that will be visible. That'll play a role in what fines you get. If you have strong leadership who are championing your data governance and data privacy programs, and you have some proof that you are taking steps to improve, that'll go a long way to mitigating some fines.
Okay, thank you. One more. Kathy asks, have you seen a change over time in the business realizing the importance of data governance?
Yes, for sure. Not as much as I would like, though. And a lot of that is coming up from compliance requirements. And I think there's always been an understanding there that something is needed. Something needs to change to improve data quality and increase trust and confidence in the data. But the appetite to actually put the required effort in has not been there. And now people are realizing they don't have a choice. These are things that they should have been doing all along, and they just need to wake up and realize that. And now they're being forced to because of compliance. Or they can't do things like create that predictive model because they haven't spent that time or implemented that level of rigor.
I have a question about that as well, and that's kind of the chicken and the egg scenario. Obviously, if you don't have a data program yet and you're just starting one, you don't even really understand the extent to which you need to govern that data. So you almost have to build it first and then govern it and then mature it. But that can be a gray area. What do you suggest?
Well, we always start off with baby steps, right? So you want to pick something small, set some guidelines for data governance. So you can even go as far as defining your initial policy first, setting up an interim data council, just a couple, really intelligent, influential people in your organization who act as a sounding board for you. And then you don't need to engage the entire organization, but at least if you've got that, then you can start identifying what you need to do to resolve some issues, mitigate some risks, and then implement those things and then start to show value, right? So you can, I've seen it done where we've gone from 0 to having a functional governance team within 3 months, and then start making small incremental changes going forward, and then expanding the scope and the membership of that group as they go. And I think that is one of the most effective ways to do it, is to start small, even with a single project, but have a view to where you want to be from an enterprise perspective and work towards that.
maybe almost the converse question is, if you tried it and it failed or didn't take, as Jed put it, what do you do to, what can you do to restart it or overcome it as perceived baggage?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's ultimately identifying something to focus on. So usually it's failing. Well, there's many reasons it's failing, but sometimes, a lot of the times, I find they try and go too big, try and do too much at once. So identifying something smaller that has a big impact, focus your efforts on that, get everybody aligned on that, then deliver that, show the value, use that to increase the amount of resources you have, or the amount of time you can allocate it, because that's usually the biggest roadblock, is how much time can people allocate to this. So use that quick win to get a little more time and get the next win, and create that backlog and just start whittling away at it. So instead of doing large projects that can take a year or more, identify quick wins that you can do within a quarter, and just keep working away at those. And every quarter you reprioritize, identify a handful, and go at it, and align everybody on that small handful of priorities.
Okay, a couple more minutes. If anybody has questions, or maybe even better yet, if anybody else has some thoughts or other ideas, what's worked, what hasn't, how does that relate to the success factors?
Michael, this is Kathy Wright. One of the techniques I've been trying out at my company, which is a pretty small company, but I've been encouraging the business to recognize that anybody who puts data into the system, into any computer, whether you're filling out a form or you're doing something with that, anytime you put data in the system, you are essentially a coder, because that data you put in impacts the behavior of that application. And trying to get people to recognize that essentially everybody in the company is a coder. And I know it's kind of pushing it a little bit, because traditionally we haven't referenced coding that way, but I'm starting to see some light bulbs go off in some of the business teams with using that as an example.
Yeah, and that's an important aspect, because quite often, that step, so seeding those systems with data, is often glossed over, and it's very important. So master data management, it also includes entering that information into that system so it can be used in transactions. So definitely, helping those people understand the impact they have downstream is important. I've never heard of calling coders or implying that they are programming at all, but usually I look at them from more of a stewardship or a data consumer perspective. But yeah, you're right in that they need to be engaged, they need to be educated, and there needs to be monitoring, not of everything they're doing, but of the data items that have a significant impact downstream. And that's where that quality control plan comes in. And then you can identify, is the issue really related to people and their practices versus something in the system? And if you can resolve that by educating those people or putting some monitoring in place on them, making their managers responsible instead of spending additional money developing data cleansing rules and methods, it's always a better approach.
Hey, Mike, this is Mick Wiskersion. I just had a quick comment for you and Sean. I've been fortunate where I've been a COO and CEO in companies at the leadership level. And I think where I've had the most success in data and getting traction around it is helping it, to your point, Sean, about educating people, educating them on the use cases of why we're applying it, and then literally how that kind of triangulates with the key performance indicators, the KPIs, and how you use it every day, and how you can move from productivity to, to your comments about churn, retention, and just growth. But I think it's back to those use cases and keeping it really simple. I love it, though. You guys did a great job today.
And I agree 100%. Like, those use cases are important, and I like to translate those right down to the outcomes and really focus on the outcomes, and then taking that to help, using that to help other people understand how their role impacts those outcomes. And if they don't do their role properly, how does that undermine the outcome and the value of what we're doing?
Exactly.
So I want to ask a question along, this is Diana Dees from Petco. And I want to ask a question along the lines of what Kathy talked about with everyone that puts in data as a coder. We always try to do less amount of, a lot of our customer data comes from our customers. And if we have to limit the amount we ask them for, because otherwise we'll lose them. Like if we're on a .com site, if they have to enter too much, all of a sudden we're not going to keep the business, right? So you want the quality to be the level that you have set for your data governance, for master data, in this case, like a customer or a pet. That always doesn't happen because the concept of being a coder, you really can't train some of those consumers. So how do you look at that concept when you don't control the people that are the contributors of the data? Even though your consumers want to have a certain quality, you're not going to always get there, and you have to live with that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's going to become more relevant as we have more GDPR type regulations coming up, where if you're collecting personal data, you're responsible for the quality of that as well. And so my feedback would be to minimize the amount of personal data you're collecting from these individuals, and only use what you absolutely need to use, right? Either to facilitate that transaction or that membership, or you have a clearly defined need to help understand your business and things like that. But as you said, that creates a situation where you have to find innovative ways to validate the accuracy of that information. You can code things to adjust, if they put in the wrong state or the wrong zip code, things like that, we can work with that. But if the information isn't accurate to begin with, then your only recourse is to reach out to them and ask them to validate it. And
that may or may not happen, right?
Exactly.
Like when we send a brick and mortar, we're sitting there, usually we ask for phone number and maybe some little information there. But that's not the same as if we're on the .com site or the mobile app, we ask for different information. So when you look at, well, what's a mandatory set? It can't always be phone number and email and first and last name, because it depends on the channel that's bringing in the master data. So we got to be flexible as data governance people and people helping understand data governance in our companies. And so I see the things that we talk about, but I also realize that it's not always perfect, and not all the rules can apply even within the same company to all the channels, is what I'm seeing.
And that's where it comes down to awareness. So understanding that that's an issue, and then having that knowledge to help you make a decision where and when you're going to use that data for other things. So if you know that that data is suspect to begin with, then you're not going to use it for something where you require higher levels of data quality. And just having that information stored in a data catalog so people can access it, so they can make a decision around data fitness, is important.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, Sean, again, appreciate it. We'll hang on for a minute if anybody wants to, but I want to halt the recording now at this point and wrap up for the day.